Yeah, kia ora koutou katoa. Today we're talking about heat as an anti-medium, some work I've done in the last year as we began to think about this new project around climate-driven heat and the future of work. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming from today, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples of Mianjin, Brisbane, and pay respects to my elders, past, present, and emerging. In the summer of 2024, the United States was racked by a series of heat waves with soaring temperatures and spiraling humidity levels. And we began to see a series of videos appearing on social media that looked like this, with workers collapsing, fainting, or vomiting midway through their shifts due to the incredible pressures placed on their bodies. Amazon Flex, of course, is the delivery arm of the global technology company, and in many respects kind of exemplifies what many consider to be the future of work paradigm, right? A vision of work which is platformized, which is driven by data-driven insights, which uses algorithmic management to bring together supply and demand products and services. And so to me, this moment, right, starts to be very interesting because we see this future of work vision coming up against um, climate realities, right, starting to break down. And so for me, this collapsing body is also a collapsing paradigm about what work is and what work should be within a climate changed world. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. I want to start then by the brief genealogy, just tracing an arc about heat. Well, heat, of course, in 1775, we see the invention of the steam engine, which essentially, of course, is a heat engine. It's predicated on the ability to tightly manage and control heat in order to do forms of mechanical work, right? And so the steam engine or heat engine, of course, it kind of really kicks off the Industrial Revolution and industrialization in the West, starting in the UK, of course, and then spreading further, closely followed by this new science of thermodynamics, which is in a different domain, but which is again sort of predicated on um, formulating how heat, in a mathematical sense, can be controlled and managed to produce work in a mathematical sense. If we skip forward from here to the early 20th century, we start to see how heat begins to be a problem for medial systems. So the first air conditioners were not built for humans, but for media production systems, namely newspaper printing systems, which had a lot of issues printing clearly with high humidity levels, high temperature levels, right? And so these air conditioning units were placed inside printing facilities in order to stabilize the climate, this microclimate, and to keep these media production systems running efficiently, effectively. If we jump forward again a little bit, of course, we get to computation, and computation sort of, starts quite crudely in a way and becomes, of course, more pervasive. And one way to understand computation is that it is a problem of managing heat, as Finn Brunton reminds us. Computation or processing produces incredible amounts of heat. And so part of the problem with systems has always been how to manage this heat, how to expel or get rid of this heat, right? With heat fins and so on. And of course, this problem becomes acute when we get to the data center, which um, puts together huge amounts of processing in a really dense way in a small space. And data center operators have techniques to manage this, with hot and cool aisles, thermal imaging, as you see here. But there's a sense in which even these techniques begin to fall down, to collapse when it comes to the recent climate pressures. So in 2022, both Google and Oracle data centers went down. Um, and the reason, after investigation, was discovered to be unseasonably high temperatures. Right. And of course, AI makes this problem even more acute, more intense, because processing itself becomes more intense. And so these high performance computing systems, these clusters, require even more drastic forms of cooling, liquid cooling, and so on. And so the arc, right? One way to understand sort of the last 200 years then of industrialization is that all of this excavation, extraction, combustion, mining, consumption, right, and so on can be considered a kind of thermal intervention at a planetary scale, right? So all of this work um, has altered the thermal envelope of the Earth so that right, more heat is becoming trapped inside it, the famous greenhouse gas effect, and this alters alters the planet and the conditions that we live in today. And so what I'm trying to trace here very, very briefly is just this kind of arc from heat, which is something that is tightly controlled, which is managed, which is leveraged to do work, uh, to heat, becomes uncontrolled, right? Becomes disruptive, becomes something that seeps into our systems in which is not desirable, which becomes chaotic. We see, the revenge of nature, the revenge of climate-driven heat, as a way to starts to undermine, I think, some of our digital and technical systems. And this brings us then to the present and back to our original issue, right, around contemporary work. And as we mentioned, right, part of the big promise of medial systems and platformization in particular has been this promise of keeping work going, of optimizing work, of keeping accumulation going, right, in spite of stagnation, in spite of um, issues, crises, economic instability, and so on. The promise has been that brilliant technologies, as one pundit put it, right, will be the kind of solution that will supercharge labor, optimize it, streamline it, keep it going, and produce a better form of work in the 21st century. And of course, the platform as an object is a core part of this promise. So the traditional way to understand platforms is that they are a nexus between producers and consumers, between supply and demand, right? Between agents who will deliver a service and people, users, customers who would like that service. And so it is mediating between these agents and then also facilitating the flows of goods and services between them. This is the promise of platformization. And I would say that platformization, right, or the future of work, if we like, is much, much bigger than simply the gig economy. We're talking about a range of different industries, sectors, service work, care work, right, healthcare, and so on, that are becoming platformized uh, with these technologies, even though, right, the workers themselves wouldn't consider themselves to be gig workers at all. And so, right, this vision of optimized work, though, really relies on a particular understanding of the world, right? And I think this is kind of key to understand is that what we start to see at this moment is what I call a peeling apart of the world as understood by the algorithm and the world as actually is, right, racked by climate crises. And so this algorithmic world is predicated on, right, bodies being able to do certain things, about people being able to make certain quotas, about a certain understanding of the city. And this is often very schematic, skeletal. Um, and that world is no longer, right, the world that we started to see, right? So when we have, for example, grab drivers in Vietnam, where flooding takes place, right? They have to decide whether it was worth risking driving through this flooded street. We have workers in Singapore talking about the sun being like feeling like burning when they go into it. We have reports now in Australia with workers saying they have to slow down. They cannot sustain the level of productivity that's expected of them. And we have larger scale reports talking about millions of hours of labor lost in the coming years and GDP losses of up to between 5 and 8% based on different countries. Right? This is incredible kinds of changes and a changing sort of environment. And none of this is really integrated or picked up in the digital systems that we are operating with today. And so, yeah, this is what I talk about when we talk about this confrontation or conflict between digital imaginaries, right, the vision of the future of work and associated technologies, and climate realities, and how these two things are not compatible in a way. Right. And so part of the problem, as I mentioned, is the what we might call a sort of ontological problem about the way the world is and what being in the world means, right? And part of this, I would say, is also, though, an epistemological problem about knowledge and about how knowledge is attained and what knowledge is worth having. And so part of the promises of algorithmic systems and artificial intelligence as the latest manifestation of this is that by collecting data in the past, we can better navigate the present and the future, right? That by amassing all this data, by combing over it, analyzing it, extracting patterns, trends, right, routines, and so on, from it, we can better anticipate and operate in the future, right? The problem, of course, with this is that, as Earth system scientists say, that the world is now a no analog world, that the world does not look like the world of the past, right? That we have Earth system scientists who have been working for 3 decades in this space, veterans, right, in their particular fields, who are shocked about what is happening now, who say that it makes no sense, and yet it is what it is, right? Um, and so we have this idea of the no analog world, where, right, it was essentially a kind of epistemic break with what has come before. And all of this suggests to me, right, that this core promise or premise of digital media systems that the future looks like the past, right, or can be extrapolated from the past no longer holds. It's beginning to break apart. And so this brings us, right, has been building towards this argument with this idea of heat as an anti-medium. Um, Media really has moved away, as John Durham Peters suggests, from this idea of um, being purely about communication, mass communication, and representation, right? About the content of certain medial forms, and towards something which is much more about coordination, orchestration, right? Logistical kind of operations, right? This is what the platform is. This is what algorithmic management is. This is what I would say a lot of AI-driven systems are now trying to do, is to use this intelligence to coordinate, to operate, rather than purely being about, right, some kind of end product image and so on. But if this is the case, right, what I've tried to show here is that heat really presents a problem. It undermines the ability of medial systems to coordinate and to operate, right? It starts to break down these linkages between agents. It starts to suggest that the body is the world is understood by the algorithm no longer corresponds closely enough to the world as it actually is. And all of this, I think, begins to disrupt the ability of our medial systems, right? So for scholars like John Durham Peters, Nicole Starosielski, excellent scholars, but they're very concerned with opening up the boundaries of media study. And so they talk about media becoming environmental. And I would say, the opposite, where I'm interested rather in the environmental pushing back against our medial systems, right? Rather than understanding everything as being some form of media, I would suggest that heat is a really interesting object in its kind of slipperiness and relentlessness, right? It starts to suggest that not everything can be integrated as another transaction, another layer, another data point into a medial system, but rather that um, we have this outside force, something which is excessive, which is a problem, which is disruptive, right? Which begins to erode our ability to control the world in precisely the way that we want. And for all these reasons, heat presents a really interesting object for me. Um, Not only, I think, critically in its sense of being able to temper some of the claims around digital media, the future of work, algorithmic imaginaries, and so on, but also positively, I think, in that it forces us, almost kicking and screaming, to start to develop ways of actually integrating climate into these medial systems, right? What would it mean to actually, rather than seeing nature constantly as this externality, something to be ignored or exploited, seeing it rather as something to be um, integrated seriously, taken seriously, right, and integrated into our medial systems. Um, and if we could start to do that, to develop more climate attuned systems, visions of work, right, digital infrastructures, and so on, we would actually start to support worker well-being on the one hand, and also planetary well-being.